It is often said that parables are earthly stories with heavenly meanings. And that's true enough as far as it goes. But it doesn't go quite far enough. Parables are analogies, a way of talking about one thing in terms of something else. Now, we usually do that because the thing we really want to talk about is far too complex or difficult to discuss directly. And so we resort to analogies to try to help the listener grasp our real subject. And therein lies the dilemma. In the case of parables, the thing about which the analogy is being made is always the kingdom of God. That's what all the parables are about. But what in this world can we point to and say, that's the kingdom of God? The kingdom is so eschatological, so countercultural, that any attempt to point to anything in this world and say, there is the kingdom of God, would be fraught with misunderstanding and unintended associations. And so Jesus tells a story, sometimes called parable, the purpose of which is to invite the listener into a world that only looks familiar and safe and normal. Then, when all of your defenses are down and you're starting to feel comfortable, he turns the whole thing upside down on you and inside out on you. Everything you thought you knew, you now no longer know. It's a teachable moment. It's a discovery moment. It's a gotcha moment. Hence, a parable is indeed an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, but it is not simply that. It is a story with a hook in it, something not right, something out of place, something so shocking, so unsettling, that it causes you to rethink everything you thought you knew about God and his kingdom. So radically different from this world, so competitive with it, so counter to it, so at cross purposes, pun intended, with it, is the kingdom of God, that Jesus must resort to these special kinds of analogies called parables to describe it. And so it isn't just an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It's a story with a hook in it, a story that only appears normal, but on second look is shocking, disturbing, unsettling, causing you to learn all over again what you didn't know you didn't know. The best modern example, in my judgment, of how New Testament parables function are the stories of the late Rod Serling on the old television series, The Twilight Zone. My favorite was an episode called The Eye of the Beholder. The story takes you into a hospital room where a woman is lying in bed, her face all bandaged from recent surgery. As the episode unfolds, so does her story. She had been born hideously disfigured and had come to hospital for reconstructive surgery. As she shares her story with the hospital staff who tend to her, whom you only see from the shoulders down, never their faces, you hear the pathos and tragedy of her pathetic life, ostracized as a child, shunned in school, unable to have a meaningful relationship, all because of her horrible disfigurement. Her hopes are at last buoyed by the prospect of a normal life once the bandages come off and her disfigurement corrected. Finally, the big day arrives, and the doctor comes into the room to remove the bandages. The doctor slowly removes the bandages, but when her face is finally revealed, you hear the doctor gasp, "Oh no," and shrink back in horror. She gets up, walks over to the mirror, and looks at her face for the first time since the surgery. "Oh my God," she shrieks. And then she buries her face in her hands, sobbing, the surgery obviously unsuccessful. Slowly, she pirouettes so that for the first time you catch a glimpse of her face. Donna Douglas, Ellie Mae Clampett of the Beverly Hillbillies. Hardly a grotesque countenance. Wait a minute, you say to yourself, what's going on here? I thought she was supposed to be hideous. And then slowly the camera for the first time reveals the faces of the others in the room, the doctors and the nurses and the hospital staff, all of whom bear the same horrible, hideous disfigurement. And then you hear Serling's baritone voice overtone. What is ugly? What is beautiful? Perhaps beauty really is in the eye of the beholder. Gotcha. Now that's a parable. And so when you read a parable, look for the hook. Look for the gotcha. Something out of place, something not quite right, something so unsettling, disturbing, troubling that it causes you to rethink what you thought you knew. That's what parables do. It's not just a simple story, it's a startling story, a story that places you in a new paradigm and puts you on a new path. One example from the New Testament. In the synoptic tradition, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus tells a story about the kingdom of God in which he likens it to a farmer going out to plant his fields. The parable of the sower, it's called. Listen, he says, a sower went a sowing. And while he was sowing, some of the seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. But other seed fell upon rocky soil, where there was not much earth, and immediately it sprang up because it had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered. And still other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it gave no fruit. But still other seed fell on the good ground, and it gave fruit growing and increasing, producing 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. My translation of the Greek. Now that's a parable. Remember, the subject is the kingdom of God. Jesus told this parable in the context of his ministry of preaching about the kingdom of God, a ministry that had started out like gangbusters, but had lately fallen on hard times. The crowds were enormous at first when following Jesus meant that all of their needs were being met for food and for healing and for restoration of one sort or another. But when Jesus started to speak of the demand of the kingdom of God, that it is a priceless pearl that will cost you everything you have to possess, the feckless folk withered in the noonday sun. And the disciples, hoping for a bumper crop of converts, started to get discouraged, the validity of the message being solely determined by the response it receives, they believed. And so Jesus told them this story to encourage them. But it doesn't take much of a Bible scholar to pick up that this story was not really very encouraging. 3 out of 4 of the seeds the farmer had hopefully planted failed to produce a thing. I mean, not even one little seedling. Do the math. That's a 75% failure rate. And Jesus' disciples, I'm sure, thought, oh, gee, thanks, Jesus. That's encouraging. So the point of your little story is most of what we do will fail? Got any more stories? But Jesus said, you didn't listen. I told you to listen. Yes, 3 out of the 4 seeds you planted with such hope failed to produce a single thing, but one did. And that one produced a harvest so bounteous that it made the whole planting process worthwhile. Because you see, this is God's seed, and it's really good seed. So stop your whining and just sow. Sow, for heaven's sakes, sow. And then leave the rest to God. It's called a parable. He who has ears to hear, let him hear.